Some mistakes don't make headlines until the rain starts falling. The first thing I heard wasn't thunder. It was the slow, hollow drip of muddy water hitting the hood of an abandoned pickup truck somewhere across the flooded street, steady enough to sound like a ticking clock. The air smelled of soaked pine, wet concrete, and diesel from emergency generators humming somewhere beyond the rising water. I stood on the crest of the old earthen embankment that had once held back the reservoir my grandfather built more than 60 years ago, boots sinking into soft clay, watching what used to be Willow Ridge Estates disappear beneath 18 inches of brown floodwater. Expensive mailboxes leaned at awkward angles. Decorative stone entry signs reflected in water that had no business being there. White SUVs sat motionless with water halfway up their wheels, while homeowners carried boxes through their front doors with expressions that shifted from disbelief to regret. At the center of it all stood Patricia Holloway. Even from nearly 200 yards away, I could recognize the bright floral designer jacket she wore like armor, now streaked with mud as she shouted at insurance adjusters who couldn't change what had already happened. 3 days earlier, she had smiled when the excavation crew tore through the spillway protecting this entire drainage basin. 3 days later, she couldn't understand why the neighborhood she promised to improve had become a shallow lake. The strange part was that nobody had sabotaged anything. Nobody had opened hidden floodgates in the middle of the night. Nobody had plotted revenge. Water had simply followed the path it had always wanted to follow. That's the thing about engineering. Gravity doesn't care about neighborhood politics. Rain doesn't recognize HOA bylaws. And dirt certainly doesn't read violation notices. My name is Nathan Cole, and until a week ago, I was just the quiet guy living on the last family farm bordering a picture-perfect subdivision outside Knoxville, Tennessee. Most people around here knew me as the engineer who kept to himself, drove an aging silver F-250 with more mud than polish, and spent weekends maintaining an old reservoir instead of playing golf. They never asked why I inspected that dam after every heavy storm or why I carried decades-old survey maps folded behind the seat of my truck. They assumed it was just another piece of outdated farmland waiting to become luxury homes someday. Patricia certainly thought so. She believed everything surrounding Willow Ridge Estates should eventually answer to the HOA, including my property, despite the inconvenient fact that my land had never been part of the development. To her, refusing to join wasn't a legal decision. It was a personal insult. It started with friendly letters, then polished warnings printed on expensive stationery, then invoices demanding association fees for amenities I couldn't even use. When I politely declined and mailed back copies of my deed instead of a check, the tone changed overnight. Suddenly, my pond became a hazard. My maintenance road became an eyesore. My dam, which had quietly protected this valley through countless storms, became an unauthorized structure in desperate need of removal. Funny how quickly something becomes dangerous when someone wants control over it. I remember standing exactly where I am now when Patricia arrived with county-colored safety vests borrowed for appearance more than authority. She pointed toward the embankment with manicured confidence and told the contractor to begin. I warned them only once. I explained that the dam wasn't decorative. It wasn't abandoned. It was part of an engineered drainage system tied to recorded water management agreements older than the subdivision itself. One of the operators hesitated. Patricia didn't. She laughed softly, adjusted her oversized sunglasses, and said community standards mattered more than outdated paperwork. The excavator started moving anyway. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply took photographs, logged the time, and stepped back. Some battles are won by arguing. Others are won by letting the facts arrive exactly when they're ready. As I watched floodwater ripple across streets that had never flooded before, I realized something my grandfather used to tell me every spring while we inspected the spillway together. He'd tap the worn wooden survey stake with the handle of his shovel and smile, without looking up. "Son," he'd say, "people can ignore a man. They can ignore a warning, but they can't negotiate with the land." Standing there with rain clouds finally breaking apart above the valley, I understood he had been right all along. Nobody inherits a dam by accident. You inherit the responsibility that comes with it. Long before Willow Ridge Estates had decorative stone entrances and matching mailboxes, my grandfather, Walter Cole, stood in the middle of that same valley wearing worn leather boots and carrying nothing more complicated than a survey chain, a shovel, and a notebook filled with measurements written in careful pencil. In the spring of 1964, after 2 unusually wet seasons flooded neighboring farms, he worked with county engineers to build a modest earthen dam that would collect runoff, reduce downstream flooding, and provide irrigation during Tennessee's long, dry summers. It was never meant to become some massive reservoir. It was practical, quiet, reliable, just like the man who built it. Every Saturday morning when I was growing up, he took me out before sunrise. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from his old green thermos, while dew soaked through my jeans as we walked the crest of the embankment. He never rushed. He would stop every few yards, press the toe of his boot into the grass, study the slope, and explain why water always remembered the easiest path downhill. I was probably 10 years old before I understood he was teaching me engineering without ever calling it engineering. To him, the land was not something you conquered. It was something you listened to. Those mornings shaped the rest of my life. While other kids dreamed about becoming professional athletes, I spent afternoons sketching drainage channels and reading old topographic maps spread across the kitchen table. Eventually, I earned a degree in civil engineering with a focus on water resources, then spent nearly 15 years designing culverts, retention basins, and flood control systems across the Southeast. My work took me through dozens of counties, but every holiday I came back to the farm because no project ever felt as important as the one waiting at home. After my grandfather passed away, the property became my responsibility. I did not see it as an inheritance worth millions of dollars. I saw thousands of small promises that had to be kept. Every spring inspection, every mowed spillway, every drainage pipe cleared before storm season, every county report filed on time. The paperwork alone filled 2 weathered filing cabinets in my office, each folder labeled by year, inspection date, rainfall totals, and maintenance records. Some people collect antiques. I collected documentation because experience taught me that records outlast arguments. Most of my neighbors barely noticed the reservoir beyond the tree line. On calm evenings, the surface reflected orange sunsets, while herons stood perfectly still along the shoreline. Families from nearby farms occasionally asked permission to fish, and I always said yes as long as they respected the property. It never bothered me. Watching a father teach his daughter how to cast a fishing line reminded me too much of my own childhood to refuse. The only people who seemed unable to leave the place alone were the leaders of the subdivision that slowly expanded toward my boundary over the years. Every new phase brought larger houses, wider streets, and more assumptions. At first, they waved politely from golf carts. Then they started asking whether I planned to sell. Later, they stopped asking and began talking as though it was only a matter of time before the farm disappeared beneath another row of expensive homes. I always answered with the same quiet smile. This land is staying exactly where it belongs. Most accepted that answer. Patricia Holloway did not. She saw undeveloped acreage where I saw family history. She saw a reservoir that could become decorative waterfront property instead of critical stormwater storage. Looking back now, I realized the disagreement between us never truly started with association fees or neighborhood rules. It started because we looked at the same piece of land and saw 2 completely different futures. She believed every acre had a price. I believed some places earned something far more valuable than money simply because generations had protected them. Standing on that embankment had never made me feel powerful. It made me feel accountable. And accountability has a strange way of demanding patience long before it ever rewards it. If Willow Ridge Estates had a queen, everyone knew exactly where she lived. Patricia Holloway occupied the largest corner house facing the subdivision entrance, a sprawling place with white stone columns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and flower beds that somehow looked professionally arranged every single week. Her oversized luxury sport utility vehicle always sat in the circular driveway polished enough to reflect the afternoon sun, and every holiday brought another collection of expensive decorations that seemed less about celebration and more about making sure everyone noticed who was in charge. Patricia was 54 years old, proudly carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no for very long, and dressed in bright designer jackets, oversized jewelry, and colorful scarves that announced her arrival before she ever spoke. Even her perfume lingered in the clubhouse long after every board meeting ended, mixing with fresh coffee and furniture polish until the entire building seemed to carry her signature. The strange thing was that she rarely raised her voice. She did not have to. She had mastered something far more effective. She smiled while delivering bad news. She complimented people before reminding them about fines. She called demands friendly reminders and described threats as opportunities to cooperate. New homeowners often believed she was simply passionate about maintaining standards. It usually took them a few months to discover that community standards somehow always matched Patricia's personal preferences. During my first year back on the farm, our interactions were almost pleasant. She stopped by with a welcome basket carrying locally baked cookies and a glossy packet explaining the benefits of joining the Homeowners Association. She spoke warmly about neighborhood unity, improved property values, and shared responsibility. I thanked her, accepted the cookies, and politely explained that my property had never been included within the subdivision boundaries. She smiled without blinking and replied that boundaries sometimes changed as communities evolved. That sentence stayed with me far longer than it should have. Over the following months, I began noticing small changes. Survey stakes appeared suspiciously close to my fence line before quietly disappearing. Real estate brochures started showing aerial photographs that included portions of my reservoir as though it belonged to the neighborhood. Visitors occasionally wandered onto my maintenance road asking where the public walking trail began because sales representatives had mentioned scenic water access during home tours. Every misunderstanding seemed harmless by itself, but together they formed a pattern that made the back of my neck tighten every time I drove through the subdivision. One Saturday morning, I attended an open community meeting simply because several neighbors I respected invited me. The clubhouse smelled like cinnamon pastries and freshly brewed coffee, while ceiling fans pushed cool air across rows of folding chairs. Patricia stood at the front beside a projector screen displaying colorful renderings of future neighborhood improvements. Decorative fountains, expanded walking paths, a lakeside picnic area. Then she clicked to another slide. My reservoir filled the entire screen. Without saying my name, she referred to it as an underutilized community resource with tremendous recreational potential. Several people nodded enthusiastically because they genuinely believed the water belonged to the development. I quietly raised my hand and explained that the reservoir sat entirely on private property, supported by recorded easements and maintenance agreements dating back decades. The room became silent for a moment before Patricia laughed softly and told everyone that complicated paperwork often confused landowners who resisted progress. A few polite chuckles followed, not because anyone wanted to embarrass me, but because they trusted the woman standing behind the microphone more than the quiet engineer sitting in the back row. As the meeting ended, she walked over carrying that same practiced smile. She thanked me for attending, straightened the colorful bracelet around her wrist, and gently suggested that paying association dues would make future conversations much easier. I answered just as calmly that ownership could not be created through monthly invoices. Her smile remained exactly the same, but something changed behind her eyes. It was the look of someone who had mistaken patience for surrender. Driving home that evening with gravel crunching beneath my tires, I caught myself glancing toward the reservoir, glowing gold beneath the setting sun. The water was perfectly still, yet I had the unmistakable feeling that a storm had already begun, even though the sky above Tennessee remained completely clear. The first certified letter arrived on a Monday morning, tucked neatly inside my mailbox between a utility bill and a seed catalog. The paper smelled faintly of fresh printer ink, and the return address carried the polished logo of the Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I unfolded it while standing beside my truck, expecting another invitation to join the neighborhood. Instead, I found an invoice demanding $1,480 in overdue association dues, late penalties, and administrative fees for services I had never requested. According to the letter, my property had benefited from community maintenance and shared amenities, making payment immediately due. I read it twice, then walked back into my office and pulled my deed from the filing cabinet. The legal description had not changed. My boundary lines had not moved. The subdivision plat still stopped several hundred feet short of my fence. I made clean photocopies of the recorded documents, wrote a short, respectful response explaining that my farm had never been subject to the association, and mailed everything back the following morning. For about a week, nothing happened. Then the violation notices began arriving one after another with almost mechanical precision. My gravel maintenance road allegedly failed community appearance standards. My equipment shed supposedly clashed with neighborhood architectural guidelines. My tractor, parked inside my own barn, somehow became an improperly stored commercial vehicle. Even the weathered wooden sign at the entrance to my farm was described as incompatible with surrounding property values. Every envelope carried the same polite language wrapped around the same unmistakable message: pay the association or expect more trouble. I refused to let frustration make decisions for me. Instead, I created a new folder inside my filing cabinet labeled Willow Ridge Correspondence. Every letter received its own numbered tab. Every envelope was dated before I opened it. Every response was copied, scanned, and filed. Years of engineering had taught me that careful records usually outlived loud opinions. One afternoon, I returned from inspecting a county bridge project and found two unfamiliar pickup trucks parked beside my outer fence. Men wearing bright safety vests stood near the reservoir, taking measurements with laser equipment, while another photographed the spillway from several angles. I introduced myself and asked what project they were working on. The older surveyor hesitated before admitting they had been hired by the Homeowners Association to evaluate possible improvements to nearby community drainage features. I calmly explained that they were standing on private property and that no permission had been granted for surveys. They apologized immediately, packed their equipment, and left without argument. Their professionalism told me they had simply accepted the assignment without knowing the full situation. The assignment itself concerned me far more than the people carrying it out. 2 evenings later, I attended another board meeting after receiving notice that my property would be discussed during an open session. The clubhouse buzzed with quiet conversation while coffee brewed near the entrance and ceiling fans pushed warm summer air across the room. Patricia stood before a large display board covered with color maps and aerial photographs. This time my reservoir was outlined in bright red marker. She described it as an aging structure that presented unnecessary liability to nearby homeowners. She spoke confidently about safety, modernization, and responsible community leadership. Then she suggested that because I had repeatedly refused to cooperate with the association, outside action might become necessary to protect neighborhood interests. Several residents looked uncomfortable. A few glanced toward me, waiting for an argument. I simply stood, introduced myself, and stated one fact. The reservoir, the embankment, and every maintenance record remained under private ownership and county oversight exactly as they always had. I thanked the board for allowing me to clarify the record and quietly walked out before anyone could turn the meeting into a debate. As the heavy clubhouse door closed behind me, I heard Patricia's cheerful voice resume as though nothing had interrupted her presentation. Driving home beneath a sky turning deep orange with the setting sun, I noticed fresh orange utility flags planted near the edge of my property where none had been the day before. They fluttered lightly in the evening breeze beside the maintenance road leading toward the dam. The sight lasted only a few seconds through my windshield, but something about those small plastic markers unsettled me far more than any invoice ever had. They looked less like survey flags and more like the first move in a plan that had already gone much further than simple paperwork. The following Thursday started with the low rumble of thunder somewhere beyond the eastern hills, although the forecast still promised only scattered afternoon showers. I was halfway through inspecting the concrete outlet structure when my phone vibrated with a call from Daniel Mercer, the county surveyor I had known for almost a decade. His voice carried the careful tone professionals use when they are trying not to jump to conclusions. He asked whether I had authorized any excavation work near my reservoir, because someone had requested old topographic records from the county archives earlier that week. I told him I had not requested anything and asked who had. He hesitated for a moment before saying the request had come through a consulting company representing a private client. He could not legally disclose more than that, but he advised me to keep an eye on my property. The call ended, leaving only the sound of cicadas buzzing through the humid afternoon and the faint splash of water flowing steadily through the spillway. That evening, another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one informed me that because I had ignored repeated notices, the association had voted to classify my reservoir as an unsafe structure affecting community welfare. Attached to the letter was a document labeled Independent Safety Recommendation. I read every page slowly. It looked official at first glance, but several engineering terms were used incorrectly, drainage elevations were inconsistent, and the report referenced photographs taken from angles that could only have been captured by standing inside my fenced property. Someone had entered without permission. Instead of calling Patricia, I placed the report beside my own inspection records. The differences spoke louder than any argument ever could. The next morning, I drove to the county engineering office carrying 2 thick binders filled with permits, inspection reports, maintenance logs, and historical surveys dating back decades. The familiar scent of old paper and copier toner filled the records room while staff members patiently reviewed each document. After nearly an hour, the senior engineering technician looked up and quietly confirmed exactly what I already believed. My dam remained listed as a privately maintained water control structure with valid historical documentation. No demolition permit had been requested through the county. No modification application had been approved. No emergency safety order existed. Those words should have brought relief, yet they somehow made me more uneasy. If nobody with legal authority had approved construction, someone else was preparing to act without it. I left copies of everything with the office and drove home beneath heavy gray clouds gathering over the valley. As I turned onto my gravel entrance road, I noticed fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the damp soil leading toward the maintenance gate. They had not been there that morning. I unlocked the gate and followed them until I reached the embankment. Bright orange paint marks now stretched across sections of the spillway. Small wooden stakes stood beside the access road, and several ribbons fluttered from nearby trees exactly like temporary construction markers. My stomach tightened. None of them belonged there. I photographed every marker from multiple angles, recorded their locations with my handheld survey equipment, and emailed the images to both the county engineering office and my attorney before sunset. Late that afternoon, I received a short voicemail from Patricia. Her voice remained as cheerful as ever. She said the association appreciated my patience while they worked toward a permanent solution that would improve safety for everyone. She ended the message by reminding me that cooperation was always easier than resistance. I listened to it twice before saving it with the rest of my records. Then I climbed onto the crest of the dam one more time before dark. A warm breeze rippled across the reservoir, carrying the earthy smell of wet grass and pine needles, while swallows skimmed low across the water chasing insects. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. The spillway flowed normally. The embankment remained stable. The reservoir reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Yet standing there in the fading light, surrounded by quiet that felt almost unnatural, I could not shake the feeling that someone had already decided the future of this place without ever understanding why it existed in the first place. Saturday morning arrived with a strange kind of silence that usually comes before a summer storm. Even the birds seemed quieter as I unlocked the filing room inside the old farmhouse and began pulling every box my grandfather had ever labeled in his careful handwriting. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, carrying the familiar smell of aged paper, cedar shelves, and machine oil from the workshop next door. I had already assembled enough documentation to prove ownership, but something kept telling me I was still missing the one piece that explained why my grandfather had been so meticulous about preserving every engineering drawing and every inspection record. By noon, I had spread decades of maps across the dining room table. Original surveys from the 1960s rested beside maintenance reports, rainfall logs, aerial photographs, and handwritten notes that described every repair completed after major storms. Near the bottom of one weathered storage box, I found a long cardboard mailing tube wrapped with faded masking tape. Across the outside, in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Do not discard ever." Inside rested a full-size linen engineering drawing dated June 1964 along with a signed cooperation agreement between my grandfather, the county engineering department, and the regional soil conservation office. The paper had yellowed with age, but every seal remained perfectly clear. As I carefully unfolded the drawing, my eyes stopped on a bold notation highlighted in red pencil. Flood retention structure number 7. Protected downstream drainage corridor. That single sentence changed everything. The dam had never existed solely to irrigate our farm. It had been incorporated into a larger watershed management plan decades before the subdivision was ever imagined. I immediately drove to the county records office carrying the original documents inside a protective portfolio. Daniel Mercer met me in the archive room where shelves stretched nearly to the ceiling, filled with survey books older than both of us. The smell of old blueprints and dry paper filled the room while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He studied the agreement for several quiet minutes before walking toward a locked cabinet that required a supervisor's key. When he returned, he placed another oversized map beside mine. The two drawings aligned almost perfectly. The modern drainage map still identified my reservoir as an active retention feature responsible for slowing storm runoff before it reached the valley where Willow Ridge Estates now stood. Daniel slowly removed his glasses and looked directly at me. He said he had never seen anyone from the Homeowners Association request these historical files. They had only asked for current parcel boundaries. They had completely overlooked the watershed records. In that moment, the entire situation finally made sense. Patricia believed she was dealing with an old farm pond owned by a stubborn landowner. She had never realized she was interfering with infrastructure that engineers still accounted for whenever they modeled heavy rainfall across the basin. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every related document and digital backups of the archived drainage plans. Daniel quietly suggested I notify both the county engineering office and the state water resources division immediately. I did exactly that from my truck before even starting the engine. Every email included photographs, scanned agreements, inspection records, and precise coordinates. Every attachment was time-stamped. Every recipient received identical information. For the first time since this conflict began, I stopped wondering whether I was right. The records answered that question far better than I ever could. Late that afternoon, I returned to the reservoir, carrying the original engineering drawing in a waterproof folder. Warm wind brushed across the surface of the water, while dragonflies skimmed just inches above the shoreline. Standing on the crest of the embankment, I compared the faded survey markers from 1964 with the steel reference pins still embedded in the ground today. They matched within inches. 60 years had passed, entire neighborhoods had appeared, property values had multiplied, and countless people had come and gone, yet the land itself had quietly remembered exactly what it had been designed to do. Looking across the calm reservoir, I realized something else had quietly changed. Until that day, I had been defending my family's property. Now I was protecting evidence that would eventually explain why everything that followed had never been caused by stubbornness, pride, or unpaid association fees. It had been caused by someone making decisions without first understanding the purpose of the ground beneath her own neighborhood. Monday morning arrived with low gray clouds stretching across the Tennessee sky like a heavy blanket, but the forecast still predicted only moderate rainfall later in the week. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, opened my laptop, and watched every email confirmation arrive one after another. The county engineering office acknowledged receipt of my documentation. The State Water Resources Division confirmed my report had been assigned for review. My attorney replied with only one sentence. Do not interfere with anyone who enters the property. Document everything. That advice sounded almost too simple, yet it matched exactly what my grandfather had always believed. Facts were strongest when nobody could accuse you of creating them. So I changed my approach completely. I stopped answering Patricia's letters. I stopped attending association meetings. I stopped explaining engineering to people who had already decided they knew better. Instead, I spent my days quietly preparing records. Every maintenance log was scanned twice. Every historical photograph was matched with its survey coordinates. Every inspection report received a digital backup stored both online and on an external drive locked inside my office safe. I even walked the entire embankment with my camera, recording slow panoramic video that showed the condition of every drainage channel, every concrete surface, every elevation marker, and every reference stake my grandfather had preserved decades earlier. By Tuesday afternoon, I installed 2 additional trail cameras overlooking the maintenance road, not because I expected trouble, but because experience had taught me that memory fades while photographs remain exactly as they were taken. The cameras blended naturally into the tree line beside old cedar trunks, quietly recording anyone entering the property without drawing attention. Later that evening, my weather radio interrupted the silence inside the farmhouse with a routine advisory. A slow-moving storm system had shifted farther east than expected. The announcer spoke calmly about several days of steady rainfall beginning later in the week. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic, just the kind of extended rain event engineers always monitored carefully because cumulative rainfall often mattered more than spectacular storms. I unfolded the watershed map across my dining table one more time and traced the contour lines with my finger. Every hillside, every drainage ditch, every seasonal creek eventually directed water toward the same valley below. The reservoir had never stopped rain. It simply slowed time, giving water somewhere safe to collect before continuing downstream at a controlled pace. Without that control, runoff would follow the steep natural channels exactly as the landscape intended. On Wednesday morning, my phone rang again. Daniel Mercer sounded unusually serious. He told me several construction vehicles had been seen entering the subdivision before sunrise along with a contractor specializing in excavation work. He did not know their assignment, but he suggested I remain available in case the county needed additional information. I thanked him and drove toward the farm without any sense of panic. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as it always had. The reservoir reflected thickening clouds overhead, while a light breeze carried the smell of damp earth through the pine trees. Everything looked peaceful. Even the spillway released water with the same gentle sound I had heard since childhood. Standing there, I finally understood why I no longer felt angry. Weeks earlier, I had been trying to convince Patricia she was making a mistake. That phase had ended. The documents now rested with the agencies responsible for evaluating them. The survey records existed. The engineering agreements existed. The photographs existed. Whether anyone believed me personally had become almost irrelevant because the evidence no longer depended on my opinion. Late that afternoon, I noticed fresh tire impressions leading toward the outer access gate again. I photographed them without following the tracks any farther. Then I climbed onto the crest of the embankment and looked across the quiet water as distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. The air smelled different now, cooler and heavier, carrying that unmistakable scent that always arrives before several days of rain. My grandfather used to call it the smell of the ground waking up. I slipped the original engineering agreement back into its waterproof case, locked my office, and left every camera recording. For the first time since Patricia Holloway decided to turn a disagreement into a campaign, I made no effort to stop whatever happened next. Sometimes protecting the truth means resisting the urge to intervene, because the strongest evidence is created when every decision belongs entirely to the people who chose to make it. The excavators arrived just after sunrise on Thursday. I knew because one of the trail cameras sent a motion alert to my phone while I was making coffee. The screen showed 2 flatbed trailers, a pair of pickup trucks, and several workers unloading equipment near the maintenance gate. The morning air outside my kitchen window was cool enough that steam still drifted from my coffee mug, and the distant rumble of diesel engines carried clearly across the valley. I drove toward the property without hurrying. By the time I reached the gate, Patricia Holloway was already standing near the embankment wearing another bright designer jacket that seemed completely out of place against the gray sky. She greeted me with the same practiced smile she had used from the beginning and informed me that the association was removing what she described as a hazardous obstruction for the benefit of the surrounding community. I calmly asked whether she had obtained a county demolition permit or authorization from the State Water Resources Division. She answered by holding up a folder containing association paperwork and said their legal advisors were fully confident in their authority. I did not argue. Instead, I quietly photographed every vehicle, every company logo, every license plate, and every person supervising the work. Then I stepped back beyond the construction area and continued recording from my own property. One contractor approached me with an uneasy expression and politely asked whether I objected to the work. I answered truthfully. I had already submitted every relevant document to the proper agencies and had explained the engineering function of the structure. Beyond that, my attorney had instructed me not to interfere. The contractor nodded slowly, glanced toward Patricia, and returned to his equipment without another word. The sound of heavy machinery echoed across the reservoir as sections of the embankment were opened to create a controlled breach. Water that had rested quietly behind the dam for decades began flowing through the new opening, first as a steady stream, and then as a broader current that followed the natural drainage channel downstream. There was nothing dramatic about it. No towering wall of water. No sudden disaster. Just thousands of gallons leaving the reservoir exactly as gravity directed them. By late afternoon, the lake level had dropped noticeably, exposing muddy banks that had not seen daylight in years. Patricia looked satisfied. She spoke with several homeowners who had gathered nearby, assuring them that an outdated structure had finally been removed and that future landscaping plans would make the area even more attractive. As I drove home, the first steady rain began tapping against my windshield. It continued through the evening, gentle but persistent, filling the air with the rich scent of wet soil and fresh-cut grass. The Weather Service updated its forecast before midnight. What had been expected to be moderate rainfall was now predicted to continue for several days as a slow-moving system stalled over eastern Tennessee. By Friday morning, the creeks feeding the upper watershed were running higher than normal. Water that once would have collected gradually inside the reservoir now moved directly through the open channel left behind by the excavation. I spent most of the day inside my office watching rainfall totals update across the regional monitoring network while preserving every notification from the agencies reviewing my documentation. Shortly after noon, my phone rang. It was Daniel Mercer. His voice sounded unusually quiet as he told me county inspectors had finally reviewed the historical watershed agreements I had submitted. They were now attempting to determine whether unauthorized work had taken place before the agencies completed their evaluation. I thanked him and looked back through the office window toward the gray horizon where rain continued falling with patient consistency. By Saturday morning, the familiar roads leading into Willow Ridge Estates had begun collecting shallow, standing water in areas that had always drained quickly before. Emergency crews placed temporary warning signs near several intersections while storm drains struggled to keep pace with runoff arriving faster than the neighborhood had ever experienced. Nobody needed to sabotage anything. Nobody needed revenge. The land was simply following the same contours my grandfather had carefully mapped more than 60 years earlier, and without the retention structure slowing that journey. Every drop of rain reached the valley exactly when nature intended instead of when careful engineering once allowed. By Sunday afternoon, the rain finally began to ease, leaving behind a sky that slowly brightened from steel gray to pale blue. The steady hum of emergency pumps echoed across Willow Ridge Estates while crews cleared storm drains clogged with branches and debris carried by runoff that had arrived faster than the neighborhood had ever experienced. Standing on the rebuilt access road overlooking the valley, I watched county engineers walk through the area with survey equipment, comparing current conditions against historical drainage maps that had been sitting quietly in government archives for decades. They did not need my opinion anymore. The evidence spoke with remarkable clarity. Every elevation matched the original watershed plans. Every drainage path followed the contours my grandfather had documented more than 60 years earlier. Most importantly, every report confirmed the same conclusion. Removing the retention structure had eliminated a critical part of the valley's stormwater management system without the required engineering review or regulatory approval. Over the following weeks, formal investigations replaced neighborhood rumors. Agency representatives reviewed permits, inspection records, archived agreements, construction photographs, and the time-stamped videos from my trail cameras. The footage showed exactly when equipment entered the property, who supervised the work, and how the embankment had been altered. My attorney hardly needed me to explain anything because every document had already been organized long before the questions began. One afternoon, Daniel Mercer stopped by the farm carrying a thick folder beneath his arm. The familiar smell of fresh-cut hay drifted across the fields while the restored creek flowed quietly through its natural channel. He smiled before saying a single word. The county had officially recognized that the historical watershed agreements remained valid and enforceable. The unauthorized work had triggered a series of administrative findings, insurance disputes, and civil claims involving the parties responsible for approving and performing the excavation. Responsibility would ultimately be determined through the legal process, but one fact was no longer in dispute. The reservoir had never been an abandoned farm pond. It had always been part of a documented drainage system protecting the valley below. Months later, restoration work finally began. This time, every contractor arrived with proper permits displayed inside their trucks. Engineers reviewed soil conditions before equipment touched the ground. Environmental inspectors monitored progress, and survey crews verified elevations at every stage. Watching the new embankment take shape felt strangely emotional because it was never about replacing dirt. It was about restoring trust in careful planning, patient maintenance, and the quiet responsibility my grandfather had carried for most of his life. When the reservoir gradually filled again after the next rainy season, the water settled into the familiar shoreline I remembered from childhood. Herons returned to the shallow coves. Children from neighboring farms asked if they could fish on Saturday mornings. I smiled and gave the same answer my grandfather always had. Respect the land, leave it cleaner than you found it, and you are always welcome here. As for Patricia Holloway, she was no longer the confident voice leading meetings inside the clubhouse. Leadership changed, new board members took over, and conversations around the neighborhood slowly shifted from appearances to preparation. People began asking better questions before approving expensive projects. They started listening when engineers explained why certain structures existed instead of assuming everything old needed to disappear. Looking across the calm water one quiet evening, I realized the greatest lesson had nothing to do with winning an argument. It was about understanding that nature keeps perfect records even when people do not. Maps can be forgotten, agreements can gather dust, and warning letters can fill filing cabinets, but gravity never changes its mind. Water will always remember the path it was designed to follow. My grandfather understood that long before I did, and now I finally understood why he insisted every survey, every permit, and every inspection mattered. Justice did not arrive because someone shouted louder. It arrived because the truth had been carefully preserved until the moment it was needed most. I would genuinely love to know what you think after hearing this story. If you had been standing where I stood, would you have reacted differently, or would you have trusted the facts and the law to speak for themselves? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading your perspective. And if stories about patience, accountability, and justice through wisdom rather than anger are the kind of stories you enjoy, I hope you will consider subscribing and joining me for the next one. There are always more lessons hidden in the places where people forget to look, and sometimes the quietest truths leave the strongest mark.